Hello, my dear students. The topic of our lecture today is teaching grammar. This topic is especially important for you as students in the College of Education, since you are expected to be graduated as teachers of English. That's why it is very important for each one of you to understand what is meant by grammar and what is the best way in which grammar should be introduced and explained to the students. So, in this lecture, we will try to answer these questions and to give you an idea about how to think about grammar. First, what's grammar? Grammar is the business of taking a language to pieces to see how it works. It is analysis of language into pieces and how these pieces are related to each other. So, we should not think about the grammar as rules, because if we describe grammar as rules of language, in this case, we suggest that somebody created rules first and then spoke the language, like a new game. But languages did not start like that. Languages started by people making sounds, which evolved into words, phrases, and sentences. So in this case, we try to describe how language is arranged or how language is produced, and we explain structures. So, no commonly spoken language is fixed. All languages change over time. What we call grammar is simply a reflection of language at a particular time. So we try to provide a description of how language is produced and the structure in which language is produced. Grammar is the mental system of rules and categories that allow humans to form and interpret the words and sentences of their language. So, it is a system. The system is provided in the mind of the speaker, and this system enables the speaker to understand the language and to produce the language. And also, grammar adds meaning or meanings that are not easily inferable from the immediate context. So, this is the idea of grammar. Of course, the most important idea that we should focus upon as teachers is the idea of grammatical structures. A specific instance of a grammar is usually called structure. Examples of structures would be the past tense, noun, plurals, the comparison of adjectives, and so on. These are the topics that might be introduced in a lesson that you want to teach. So we face such ideas in teaching language, or and specifically when we teach the grammar of this language. Not all languages have the same structures. The English verb has aspects such as the progressive she's going. For example, in German, we have masculine, feminine, or neuter gender to its noun, which English doesn't. So in this case, languages are different in the grammatical structures. This might cause some problems to language learners. So sometimes students cannot learn unfamiliar grammatical structures easily, and sometimes, occasionally, foreign structures that look strange may be surprisingly easy to master, and vice versa. So, in this case, we should pay attention to the differences between the structures of the native language and the target language, because this might be either a reason for difficulty, or it might be helpful to students to learn certain structures. Units of language. Of course, if we talk about units of language, we talk about discourse or text. But in relation to practical purposes or in relation to teaching purposes, the sentence is probably the most convenient-based unit. Smaller units are the clause, the phrase, the word, and morpheme. First, we want to have, of course, we are all familiar with the idea of the sentence, but we want a specific description of sentence. The sentence is a set of words standing on their own as a sense unit. Its conclusion marked by a full stop or a question mark or an exclamation mark. So, in many languages, sentences begin with a capital letter, as is in English, and include a verb. Another unit is the clause, which is a kind of mini sentence, a set of words which make a sentence unit but may not be concluded by a full stop. A sentence may have two or more clauses like she left because it was late and she was tired, or only one like she was tired. Another unit is the phrase, which is shorter than the clause and it is within the clause. One or more words but fulfilling the same sort of function as a single word, like was going and a long table. Was going is a verb phrase and a long table is a noun phrase. The word is the minimum normally separable form. In writing, it appears as a stretch of letters within a space either side. The morpheme is a bit of a word which can be perceived as a distinct component within the word past. For example, are the two morphemes pass and ed. A word may consist of a single morpheme like book. So we know that the word is a unit which is distinguished by a space. And we have different types of words, as you know. Well, the morpheme is the smallest unit. Sometimes the word consists of one morpheme and sometimes it includes more than one or two morphemes. Also, we need to know, and of course they are very familiar to you, different parts of speech. Sometimes when you explain grammatical structures, you refer to them. Different parts of the sentence may be realized by various kinds of words or phrases. These are called parts of speech. First, we have nouns. Nouns are traditionally characterized as naming a person, a place, or a thing. But in fact, they may refer to activities or events such as conversation, battle, abstract, beauty, theory, and various other kinds of things. They usually function as do pronouns as subject, object, or complement of a verb. So, the noun and the pronoun functions as the subject, object, or complement of a verb, or follow prepositions. They may be preceded by a determiner like the, some, for example, or by adjectives and may take the plurals s. So we are all familiar with nouns, but here we have a quick description to the idea of nouns just to attract your attention to the fact that sometimes we need to think about parts of. A very important part of the sentence is the verb. Verbs are often called words of doing, like swim, sit, but they may have also indicate a state of being, feeling, being in a relationship too. So, like examples like remain, regret, proceed. Verbs can be used in different senses, like the present tense, the past tense, the present continuous, present simple, present perfect, etc. So, and they can also be either active or passive. It is useful also to distinguish between transitive verbs and intransitive verbs. Transitive verbs are verbs that take a direct object like hit and feed. Intransitive verbs are verbs that do not take objects like love and fall. Or sometimes we have verbs that can be either depending on context like fight and relax. Adjectives normally describe the things referred to by nouns or pronouns. Black, serious, they may function as complement or be attached to a noun. Also, we have adverbs that describe the concepts defined by verbs like quickly, alone, or adjectives and other adverbs like extremely, quite, or an entire sentence or a situation like unfortunately and perhaps. Of course, you are all familiar with this idea. Also, we have pronouns, which usually function as substitutes for nouns or noun phrases like he, him, who, those, and like them may function as subject, object, complement, or follow a preposition. Auxiliary verbs may be attached to the main verb in a verb phrase like is going. Also, we have modal verbs such as can, must, may. They are particular types of auxiliary verbs. They express ideas such as possibility, ability, compulsion, a probability, willingness. Determiners, they can be used to introduce nouns or noun phrases like the, a, all, some, many. Prepositions are used to define time, space, and more abstract relationships and precede nouns or pronouns. We are all familiar with prepositions, so these are the parts of the speech that might be introduced and that you might face in the process of language teaching. Here we have two important ideas, the idea of a presentation and the idea of a practice. First, the teacher is supposed to introduce the grammatical structures which are the focus of the lesson. In a particular lesson, we might have one or more than one grammatical structure to be introduced to the students. So first, it should be presented by the teacher. The presentation should not take long time. It is just an introduction to the new idea or the new grammatical structure, which is the focus of the lesson. And it should be followed by students' practice. In relation to presentation, a good presentation should include both oral and written forms and both form and meaning. So first, if you have a grammatical structure, you should produce it to your students orally and in a written way on the board in order to have clear understanding about this grammatical structure, and at the same time you should talk about the structure and in the meaning which is related to this structure or indicated by this structure. It is important for learners to have plenty of contextualized examples of structure and understand them. So, contextualized examples are especially important. The students are supposed to understand the grammatical structures or to be the grammatical structures should be introduced to the students within context in order to help them to understand meanings indicated by these grammatical structures and the way in which they are used in real communication. Visual materials can also contribute to understanding. The text can include different visual ideas that the student can see in order to have better understanding of a particular grammatical structure. So this point or the idea of visual material is related to the student's situation and level of language proficiency. On the whole, older and more analytical minded learners will benefit more from the use of terminology, the use of terms, and in advanced stages, Students can benefit from the use of terms and definition of terms, grammatical terms, but you should be careful that the terms that you use are supposed to be appropriate to the level of your students. And this is again depends on your student's situation and level. So this is the problem about striking the right balance between accuracy and simplicity referred to in earlier. So your explanation should cover the great majority of instances learners are likely to encounter. Your presentation should include simple ideas. At the same time, it should be accurate. So you should provide them with something accurate, correct, perfect, and you should introduce it in a simple way. Presentation should be followed by practice. I mean students practice. The aim of a grammar practice is to get students to learn structures so thoroughly that they will be able to produce them correctly on their own. So, practice is very important in order to help the students to master the grammatical structures perfectly, but it is unsatisfactory for students to be able to produce correct samples of a structure only when they are being specifically tested on it. Many of us are familiar with the phenomena of learners who get full marks on all the grammar exercises and tests, but then make mistakes in the same structure when they are composing their own free speech or writing. This is the idea that we should enable the students to practice the prediction of the grammatical structure, not only knowledge of the grammatical structure, because knowledge is not enough. If they know the grammatical structure and how or what are the different aspects of this grammatical structure and how they are related to each other, without having enough practice, they will not be able to produce it in real communication, whether in speech or in writing. That's why practice is very important. And we should pay special attention to the idea of a practice of grammatical structures, and it should be done that the students should practice the prediction of a grammatical structure in contextualized examples. The problem in such a case is that these structures have not been thoroughly mastered. The learner still depends on a measure of conscious monitoring in order to produce them correctly. So learners are as if they are memorizing the grammatical structures. They can answer questions in a test, but this is not enough. They should also be able to use them correctly when they produce language, whether spoken or written. Here we have a very important point depending on this or in relation to this. Many authors have developed frameworks for grammar teaching that emphasizes the incorporation of a focus on grammar into meaningful communication. So this is the point that students are supposed to have knowledge of grammatical structures and to use this knowledge in meaningful communication. And here we need to have clear understanding about the way we think about grammar and we view grammar and how grammar should be introduced. And we have two different views, the traditional view to the introduction of grammar and the new view. The traditional view, traditionally teachers believed in the importance of grammar and the teacher's role as explainer. Teachers understand grammar as language and how we use it. At the same time, they believe it to imply learning of rules and then control the practice of these rules with little or no communication. We mentioned that controlled practice might be successful in helping the students to know the structures and answer questions in the text, but it is not useful in making the students use the language to communicate in real situations. That's why it is not enough. Controlled practice is not enough. The students are supposed to have communication. Controlled practice with no or little communication is useless. Grammar doesn't have to be like this and should not be. Teachers' knowledge about language and language learning should be directed towards understanding what students need to know when they are learning a language, which means when they are using the language in real communication. Nowadays, there are many different views about what learners need to learn and how best to go about teaching it. Although language teachers should not ignore the fact that knowledge of grammatical rules is essential for the mastery of language, since we cannot use words unless we know how they should put together. Knowledge is knowledge of grammar is important. Teachers cannot ignore the importance of grammar because we cannot produce the language without knowledge of grammar. But at the same time, language teachers should realize that explanation and active teaching started to be questioned in language teaching context, which means it started to be rejected. What do we mean by active teaching? Explaining grammatical structures most of the time of the lesson without giving the students enough chance to practice the grammatical structures and real language production and real communication started to be questioned and rejected. Learners need to have exposure to the language. They need to notice and understand items being used. Try to use the language themselves in practice. That's why learners need to understand the form, meaning, and use of the item. It is not enough to understand the form and its meaning, but also in what way this form or structure is used in real communication. So here we have a very, very important idea, which is language use, which is the ability to communicate using the target language with grammar or with correct grammatical structures. So in order to do so, our focus should be directed towards knowledge of grammatical structures and practice of these grammatical structures and developing students' ability to use them in real communication. That's better for learners to observe the rules intuitively through communicative activities than to use them in grammatical exercises. Communicative activities are more useful than grammatical exercises. So it is very important to introduce grammatical structures in communicative activities. In this case, learning of grammar should be seen as one of the means of acquiring a thorough mastery of language as a whole, not as an end in itself. So when we study grammar, this is one step in knowledge about language and how to use language in real communication. Teachers should focus on students' ability to use grammar structures accurately, meaningfully, and appropriately. We mean appropriate to the situation in which communication takes place. Knowledge of a grammar is a fifth skill that students can use productively, not only as an area of knowledge. So, we should not be satisfied as language teachers with knowledge of grammar to our students. Our students are supposed to know the grammatical structures, and in addition to this, they should be able to use these grammatical structures in language production, whether this language production is written. That's why we have authentic use of grammar. In authentic use of grammar, we have oral or written activities that focus on real life communication and they focus on fluency. That is, using language easily without hesitation in the same way as we use our native language. So we should use authentic use of a grammar, the use of grammatical structures that we introduce in natural communication and in real situations which are related to everyday life. And also, grammatical structures are supposed to be introduced in communicative activities. What's meant by communicative activities? It means situations where students use language to communicate real meaning rather than just practicing language. And we talked about this in our explanation of the communicative approach. We mentioned that a real communicative activity includes gap filling, includes choice, and it includes feedback. So these are the idea or the features of communicative activities. We have three dimensions in teaching grammar: form, meaning, and use. First, the students are supposed to understand form, which means syntax, the structure of the sentence or the structure of the grammatical uh, idea which is introduced in the lesson. Then they should understand in what way the meaning is expressed in this or that structure, which means to understand the semantic aspects of the grammatical structures being introduced, and finally use when and why it is used. And also students are supposed to practice how to use these grammatical structures in real communication. Previously, we talked about two ways of presenting grammar. They are deductive and inductive. Today, we express the advantages of each type. First, deductive approach to introduction of a grammatical structure, which starts within the presentation of a rule, and is followed by examples in which the rule is applied. The grammar rule is presented and the learner engages within it through the study and manipulation of examples. So in this case, first we have the introduction of rules and then we have the application of these rules in different examples. This approach to the introduction of the presentation of grammatical structures has certain advantages. First, the students will learn the grammatical structures directly. It gets straight to the point and can therefore be time-saving. Many rules, especially rules of form, can be more simply and quickly explained than illustrated from examples. Number two, it respects the intelligence and maturity of many, especially adult students, and acknowledges the role of a cognitive process and language acquisition. So in this case, the students are supposed to understand the rules and apply them in language production, and this might give them a kind of mental practice. Also, it confirms many students' expectations about classroom learning. The students' expectation when students go to study in any institution, they expect that the teacher will explain the material and they are required to learn it. So they expect, let us say, most of the time will be explanation by the teacher and introduction of rules. This way of introduction of a grammatical structure might satisfy students' expectations about the way learning takes place. Also, it allows the teacher to deal with language points as they come up rather than having to anticipate them and prepare for them in advance. So sometimes the teachers can present the grammatical structures easily since they are not introduced in examples. Grammatical rules are either presented deductively or inductively. We have inductive approach to the introduction of grammatical rules in which the students are supposed to discover the rules and to infer the rules from examples given by the teacher. In this case, we have certain advantages. First, rules that learners discover for themselves are more likely to fit their existing mental structures. And in this case, they will be more meaningful, memorable, and helpful to students. Another idea which contributes to making the rules more memorable is that the inductive way of understanding the grammatical structure ensures a greater degree of cognitive depth. So here the students will do a cognitive and mental effort that helps them to understand the rules and memorize them or remember them in a better way. Also, when the students attempt to infer or to discover the grammatical structures, they will be more actively involved in the learning process rather than being simply passive recipients. They are therefore likely to be more attentive and more motivated. So, in the attempt to discover the rules, the students will be active. They will be involved in the process of language learning. They will pay attention to discover the rules, and they will have a motivation to understand the rules since they are attempting to understand them from the example provided by the teacher. Also, it is an approach which favors pattern recognition and problem solving abilities, which means understanding the grammatical structures and trying to understand or to solve a particular mental problem. In this case, it is suitable for learners who like this kind of challenge, learners who like to study, who like to do effort in the process of learning, would like this approach to the introduction of grammatical structures. If the problem solving is done collaboratively, which means the students work together to find out the structures or to discover them, in this case, learners get the opportunity for successful language practice. Working things out will make the students more autonomous. They can depend on themselves in understanding language. So the students will not be depending on the teacher all the time in providing them with information about the grammatical structures that they need to know.